At a very rough shape of the Bixie haircut, primarily using square layers. Now that I have that done, I'm gonna go in and start to show you some of my favorite ways to personalize this haircut and any other haircut moving forward. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start in the nape section of my guest's head. During the pre-cut, what I did is I worked with light graduation in her nape. The reason I wanted to do that was to start to build a little bit of weight in the back of my guest's head in order to then collapse the weight with layering as I move higher up. What I want to do is go in and start to detail out the heaviness of the shape that I've already created. To do so, I've taken the liberty to go in and take organic sectioning, so zigzag sections, to really break up any hard lines that I've already created within my cut. Once I have my zigzag sectioning done, I'm gonna go in and start to pick up vertical sections of hair with light tension, and I'm gonna go in with my shear, coming from the top, working down, gently opening and closing to make the ends a little bit skinnier. I'm gonna continue to pick up my vertical sections and slowly remove the weight on the shape that I've created. The reason I'm using organic sections is so that way I'm not creating any lines within the shape that I'm envisioning. When I think of a Bixie cut, I think of something that has a lot of weight released, a little bit piecier, and as far as the length goes, that's gonna depend on the guest themselves and what we've talked about. In this case, specifically, my guest wants to keep a little bit of length, but wants to remove quite a bit of length within the shape. As I'm slowly removing this weight, we can start to see how the shape's starting to shatter a little bit. Once I'm comfortable with the amount of movement I've started to add, before dropping down my next section, I do want to go in and use a little bit of a channel cutting technique. Whenever I'm going to be channel cutting, what I'm doing is I'm taking my shear and keeping the stationary part of the blade. I'm going to rest it against the guest's head. I'm also going to have my guest look down and slightly tilt to the side. So that way I can get my body closer to the shape that I'm working on. Because of the shape, I want her perimeter to slightly come forward and hug her neck. And so in order to do that, I'm gonna take the section I'm gonna be cutting on and push it in the direction I wanna see it live. Once I'm comfortable with the direction that it's sitting in, I'm then going to take my shear, rest my stationary blade against the neck of my guest, and slowly open and close my shear as I move down the section I'm cutting on. What this is doing is it is going to be creating an obvious disconnection within the length while also removing weight and enhancing the pieciness. I'm gonna work towards the opposite side to create a little bit of balance within my shape. Keeping in mind that I am working in the hairline. And if there's anything I know about hairlines, it is that they do tend to have a mind of their own. So being cautious about the amount of weight being taken out is going to be highly important for this. Because if I take too much weight out, what can happen is I can encourage the natural flips and kicks of an individual's hairline. So that's why I'm honestly going in and cutting on dry hair, so that way I can really have an idea of exactly what my individual guest's hair wants to do and how it wants to live. Now that I've dropped down my next section in the nape, I'm gonna go in and continue with my slight twist and slide motion. You'll notice that I'm keeping the focus on the center of my blade. What that's going to do is, regardless of the shear that we're working with, the sharpest part of the blade is always going to be in the center. So when I'm working with a slide technique, it's important to make sure I'm using a sharp blade, so that way nothing's pulling on my guest, also so that way that my guest can't hear it. Flip up this little guy that wants to keep falling out on us. Continuing to work on the left side first and then moving over to the right. One of the reasons I love to work on my left side first is because I personally am right-handed. And because of that, I know that my left side is my weak side. So it's really important to me to be able to perfect the left side of my shape and then go in and match the right side. Because I know my right side is always going to be the easier option for me. You'll notice how much I'm moving my guest's head around in order to get myself and my body in a position that I can easily work and move around my guest's head. I'm gonna switch to a longer shear. The stronger the angle of my channel cut, the stronger the end result is going to be, whether my guest's hair is going to kick forward or kick to the side. Once again, today what we're here doing is focusing on personalization and customization techniques to perfect a Bixie haircut shape. However, even though we're working on a Bixie today, the majority of these techniques can be used on any haircut shape. This is something that I love to use for really thick or coarse haired clients in order to start to really remove that density in the nape. Once I am happy with the amount of weight I've removed, I'm then going to move past the nape and start working on the interior of my shape. The way that the interior was created originally was working with square layers. So when I comb out, we can see that we do have a heavier shape. Because of this, I want to go in and I'm going to utilize a couple different personalization skills to showcase different ways that I like to remove weight in my haircuts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to section out the top half of my guest's head. When I say the top half, what I'm focusing on is everything that follows the parietal ridge. The parietal ridge is extremely, extremely important in a haircut because what it does is it's going to separate the top half and the bottom half of the head. The hair that lives on the top of the head is going to react a lot differently than the hair that lives below it. The hair below the parietal ridge is going to fall naturally. What it gives us is what we're going to get as a result. When we're speaking to the top half of the head, that's going to have to travel over the round of the head. So understanding these really specific parts of the head shape is the first step to really customizing and personalizing a shape for the guests in our chair, because no two guests have the same head shape. Once I have sectioned out my horseshoe section, now I'm going to be focusing on what I like to call zone 2 of the haircut, aka everything above the nape and below the parietal. As we can see, the shape's fairly heavy to start with. I'm also working around the ear. In this case, I want to see the ear carved out a little bit more, so that gives me options. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to release weight while I'm cutting a little bit of length. And in order to do so, I'm going to be working in horizontal sections, pulled out at a 90-degree angle from the head, because I know that whenever I'm using a layering technique, if I'm working at a 90-degree angle, that is automatically going to start removing weight from my shape. I also want the overall shape to be very soft and whimsical, lived in. So in that case, I want to make sure I'm not going in and creating any heavy lines. Pulling straight out from that 90, and I'm going in with a deep point cut technique, utilizing my ring finger to stabilize my shear so that way it's not just free in the air. As I'm starting to remove that weight, we can already see how this is starting to soften the shape around the ears. I'm going to continue to work with horizontal 90-degree sections and deep point cutting around the head. So I'm working with a moving guide. And I'm gonna work until I get to the center back of the right-hand side. My favorite part about deep point cutting is it gives me a lot of control for the end result of the shape. What I can do is change the pitch of my shear, whether it be from the right or to the left, pointing one direction or the other, to enhance or remove the natural fall of the hair. So in this case, I would like to see my layers kind of coming a little bit forward. So in that case, once I have my subsection at my 90-degree angle horizontally, I'm gonna take the pitch of my shear and point it in the direction that I would like to see the hair live. Keeping in mind that short hair is always going to push long hair. Slowly counteracting the natural fall and enhancing the end result. The number one thing that is helpful for our guests, the thing that allows our guests to really feel like they have an incredible haircut, is the ease of styling. I like to think of products as the cherry on top, something that is going to perfect a shape that's already there. Because I know by going in with different personalization and customization techniques, I'm creating something very specific for the guest that's wearing the shape. And something that is based off of, whoopsies, let's grab a different comb. Something that is going to really allow them to have freedom within their routines in the mornings or whenever they are styling their hair. One of the most important aspects I feel of detailing and personalizing a haircut is taking our time. I know for me personally, when I first started cutting hair, the detail aspect of the cut was something that I would allow maybe 10 minutes for at the end of creating a shape. But what I have found with more and more education and practice throughout the years is that the detailing part of our haircuts, that is exactly what is making something specific for the guest wearing it. So really taking our time and really watching and seeing what the different techniques we're doing are giving us as a result before moving on to our next section or our next technique.
David says, what a pleasure listening to Erica Mumi share her haircutting knowledge.
Thanks, David. Continuing, working to that center back. And please, for those of you watching, by all means, please utilize the chat box, ask questions. I am here to help today, and I'm honored to be able to share knowledge with you. Going in, I'm starting to see how soft this shape's starting to get, but what I would like to see is I want to see this hug her neck maybe a little bit more. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to my channel cutting technique to create a little bit more obvious separation within the shape. Also, to connect those lines between the layer and the graduation that I started with.
Deborah says, detailing is everything about the design.
Yes, the details are in the design is one of my favorite quotes.
Ooh, what's up, Jeremy Taylor? Jeremy said, what's up, my friend?
Hello, Jeremy. Jeremy is actually one of my personal mentors and friends who has taught me so much about just hair cutting as a whole. So thank you so much for tuning in. One thing that we can really see as I'm cutting is as I'm taking this weight out, can we see how the natural movement and texture of my guest's hair is starting to really start to show itself. It's starting to become more and more accentuated. This also is a shape that I have zero product in so far. So being able to truly see the difference in the weight removal already is something that fills my soul. One of the best parts about detailing a haircut shape, honestly, is being able to see exactly what we're doing while we're doing it. That's also something that works wonderfully for our guests because they're able to see everything that we're doing and it becomes something that they can also be involved in. Moving back to my opposite side, I'm taking horizontal sections at a 90-degree angle with a deep point cut. because I do want the hair to live towards the face, you'll notice that my shear blade is directed towards the face, because whichever direction the tip of my shear is pointed is the direction it's going to be encouraged to live. So I'm going to tilt slightly forward, only focusing on this front half, so that way I'm not cutting on the hair that's elevated above 90 degrees because I have turned my finger and hand placement. I'm going to continue to work the left side to the center back. And then notice when I'm closing my shear is when I'm pulling it away. This is going to prevent me from cutting myself. It also is giving me more control on the hair that I'm working on. Especially in the situations where we are working with dry hair, it really is important to make sure we're taking our time so that way we have complete and total control over the shape we're creating. As we know, when we cut hair that is wet, it is a little bit easier to hold within our hands and really start to take control of the shape we're creating. But when we're dry cutting, it does become extremely important to make sure that we are really making sure we are watching and paying attention to the hair that we're working on.
Jeremy has a great question for you today. It says, when detailing, do you prefer to use your shear over a texturizing shear? And if so, why?
So for me personally, I like to toy with both. However, a little story about myself. When I first started cutting 13 years ago, I realized that I was extremely reliant on my blending and texturizing shears. Solely because of that recognition, what I did was I took them out of my kit for a few years because I wanted to make sure when I was utilizing them, I had intention. So fast forward to now, I do utilize texturizing shears quite a bit. Ultimately, what it's going to come down to is the goal at the end, also the type of formation or curl that my guest has. Because if my guest is extremely curly or highly coiled, I generally want to stay away from texturizing and focus on manipulating the weight to where it's gonna live in a better way. I hope that answers your question. Now that I've gone through and I've diffused the weight lines throughout the sides and the back in the zone 2, which is once again above my nape but below my parietal ridge, so really the insides, the interior of the haircut, I'm really gonna start focusing on what I feel is the most important part to our guests, and that's gonna be the top half, so everything above our parietal ridge. This is keeping in mind the hair that has to travel over the round of the head, so that's why I really like to cut above the parietal on dry hair, so once again, visually, I know exactly what I'm going to get. We can already see the shape that I have slightly created, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start in the front area of my guest's head and work towards the back. As we know, the front portion of a haircut is going to be the most important to our guests because that's what they see every day. That's why I personally feel it's important to start in that area so that way I can base the rest of my lengths off of exactly what I'm doing in the front for this shape specifically. So what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm carving out my fringe section on the rough draft of the Bixie cut that we've already created. Because she already has a fringe, I want to go in and enhance it. I'm thinking for this shape specifically, I would like to see it a little bit shorter, but I'd also like to hold on to a little bit of this winged area just to really accentuate the details in the haircut shape. The way that I'm going to begin structuring my fringe is I'm gonna first section out the longer aspects of the curtain. So that way I'm not grabbing that hair and getting ahead of myself. Not sure if you guys ever do that behind the chair, but I know that it can be easy to get lost within our haircuts because we get excited. I'm excited about this. My guest is excited about this. So starting with my primary focus on the center portion of her fringe. I'm going to take a center profile guide. I'm going to pull it straight out from where it lives. So for a side view, I'm gonna be pulling her straight out. So I'm not dropping down because I don't want to graduate the shape and make it heavy, but I'm also not elevating and because I don't want to overly layer the shape either. Straight forward, and I'm gonna blunt cut to give me a guide. Once I drop down my guide, I'm gonna comb it out to see if I like where that shortest piece is hitting, and I'm thinking I like that for the shortest piece. Now that I have my guide created, I'm going to split it into two, pushing one to the left side and one half to the right side. To follow and finish my curtain fringe, I'm gonna move my body positioning to the opposite side of where my section's at, and I'm gonna be standing about a 45-degree angle off of the eye. It's important that my subsectioning is clean and that my gust is not sitting too high up because that's bad for our posture. I don't ever want to see my elbow above my shoulders. With my gust looking straight ahead, I'm going to be taking the hair from the right-hand side, over directing to the left. I can see the guide that I've created, and I'm going to follow that line.
Is that the way you initially cut the fringe?
Yes, it is exactly
Awesome.
how I cut it. This is one thing that I prefer to showcase more than once. It's my favorite way to cut a lot of my fringes and face frames, to be completely honest.
And then are you going to texturize the same way that you cut? Same body position?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. You guys are reading my mind. I'm now going to move my body back over to the right-hand side of my guest head. I'm picking up the hair from the left-hand side, and I'm going to, once again, over-direct. My body positioning is about 45 degrees off of the eye, and my hand positioning is going to be parallel to the exterior line of the triangle that I used for sectioning originally for my shag. Not shag, curtain fringe. I can see my guide. I'm gonna go in and cut blunt. And the reason I'm cutting blunt is to really showcase how when we work with the head shape, how much weight we are already removing as we're cutting. I'm gonna start to drop down the longer pieces from her fringe. So that way we can finish and detail out her fringe to use as a guide to length for the rest of our shape. Paying close attention to where I'm pulling the hair from. I never want to be in a position where I'm working so quickly that I overlook where I'm sectioning and potentially pull hair from somewhere on the head shape that doesn't live in the fringe. Because I know when that happens, generally speaking, I have to go in and texturize quite a bit to soften the lines that I've accidentally put in. I'm going to go back, split my fringe in half, starting with the hair on the right-hand side. I'm going to move my body to the left, 45-degree angle off of her eye, keeping my hand positioning parallel with the exterior line of my triangle for the fringe. I can see my guide. This time, I'm going to slightly change my hand positioning to be elevated up a little bit more in order to keep a little bit of extra length for that tail of the fringe. So what I'm doing is adding a little bit more disconnection.
We had a question from Jennifer about the parting in the top and if it was a triangle or a circle. So I'm going to zoom in for you.
We are working off of a triangle. The highest point of our triangle is starting right in front of the highest point of the head, not directly on the highest point, because right in front of the highest point of the head, where the head starts to round down, that's going to allow the hair that lives there to only live forward. That way we're not ending up with hair that we've cut as a fringe maybe, that's living as a layer on the side. It's also important to make sure that my triangular section is extremely clean, because that's what I'm using to base and understand exactly where my hand and body positioning needs to be. So if you look, you'll see my finger positioning is parallel with the triangle parting. that's telling me I know exactly where my body needs to be because I want them to be perfectly parallel. I also like to double check with my comb to create a slight bridge, is what I like to call it. So taking the flat of my comb, placing it on the line of the parting, and then making sure my hands are parallel by making sure that comb is in a straight line, aka a bridge.
Awesome. Jennifer, hopefully that answered your question. If you have any follow-up. And then Jeremy asked, does this work on all hair formations?
This does. This, as I said previously, is my go-to favorite way to create a fringe that's going to be shorter in the center and longer on the sides. The one thing I would change up is if I'm working on a high formation, so if I'm working on one of my coiled or highly curly gusts, the one thing that I would do different is my tension's going to change. Also, depending on the density of that gust hair, the elevation might change a little bit. Or I may over direct a little bit more to hold on to a little extra length, depending ultimately on the shape that I'm creating. But at the end of the day, yes, same breakdown, just a little tweak in the tension.
Awesome. And Kellen said, coolest way to check positioning and nice tip for proper elevation from JT.
Awesome. Okay, so now that we have another rough draft of our fringe, she's already super cute. I probably don't need to detail a ton, but that's what we're here for today, so that's what we're about to do. My favorite way to go in and detail out a fringe is using twist cutting. And whenever I utilize twist cutting, the reason I'm using it is to direct hair to live in a specific area that it maybe does not on its own. So going back to the short is always going to push long. It's always going to be something extremely important in a haircut, but it's especially important when we're detailing a haircut. I'm going to take a narrow sliver of the exterior portion of my fringe to work on first. I'm then going to comb everything else out of the way, so that way I'm really straightforward about the hair in my working space. Because this is going to be what I like to call the tail of the fringe, I know I want it to kick back away from her face. In order to do so, I need to make sure that I'm cutting the hair that's on the inside of the fringe rather than the outside. If I were to cut a shortest piece on the outside, that's gonna give me something very similar to a Christmas decoration, where it's there for visual effect, but not really serving a purpose. So if I flip my fingers, what that's gonna do is it's gonna expose the inside of the haircut. This is where I want my shortest pieces to push my longer pieces on top in order to kick it out away from the face. So to break this down, I'm taking my 2 piece fingers with my palm facing away from me. I'm then going to flip them up to point into the air, making my palm exposed facing myself. I'm then going to move a little bit further down the section I'm cutting on, so that way I can ease up my tension. And I'm gonna come in with my shear. I'm gonna slowly open and close as I'm working down. So that way I'm not removing a ton of length, but we can already see as I drop that section how it's really starting to kick back. But what it's also doing is it's removing a little bit of weight at the same time, so that way my fringe doesn't end up super heavy. Because once again, the Bixie cut, or I like to call it a pixie bob hybrid, is a very cute, playful, fun-loving haircut. And when I think of something that's going to be playful, I think of a shape that's gonna have a lot of movement and a lot of softness to it. I'm gonna continue utilizing this technique until I reach the center of my gust part. And then I'm going to switch to the opposite side and switch up my body positioning. Keeping in mind my elevation. You'll notice that my elevation is not lifted, because once again, with elevation, we give ourselves a little bit of layering. And what I don't want to see is an excessive amount of layering within my gust fringe, because what I'm doing is I'm creating movement and weight removal. Now that I'm looking at the side, I'm liking the way it's living. I like the angle it's being directed to, but what I would like to see is maybe a little bit of weight out of it. So I'm continuing to work only on one side of the fringe. I'm gonna utilize my comb because it is shorter hair that I'm working on, and I don't want to increase my tension on accident and then create something that is going to end up too short in that hairline. So I'm using my comb for control. I'm gonna go in and use my deep point cutting, but notice my angle of the shear. The more my blade is tilted or angled in the hair that I'm cutting in, the more weight it's going to remove.
We had a question, could you go and point cut the underneath section?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The beauty of customizing a haircut, truly, I feel, is there isn't a right or wrong as long as we can understand the science and the structure of the guest we're working on. All of these techniques are created to create magic. Once we understand the different ways to utilize or different options within personalization techniques, it becomes so fun to combine them to create something very special for the guest wearing the shape. It's also something that I feel really allows us to put our own personal brands on what we're doing. I feel that, so for myself, I'm a generalist behind the chair. I color guests as well. I feel like it's very easy to put our own brand on our color applications. However, something that is not talked about too often is putting our own specific brand on the cuts that we're creating behind the chair. And that is something that is really important to me. So really understanding the different texturizing techniques that we have available to us, or even creating new ones, and then combining them together is the ultimate way to brand everything we're doing behind the chair. I don't know about you, but my goal in life is to, whenever somebody's walking down the street, somebody next to me goes, "You cut that haircut." That's my goal. That is the ultimate goal. How are we liking the shape we're creating with our fringe? Thinking, I like the amount of weight that's removed. I like that we're shorter in the center and that we still have our wing. So now that we've created a good shape for our fringe, I'm now going to move into our last section, which is everything that lives above our bridal ridge, our horseshoe section. I'm gonna give you a little view of the shape that's created in here. I intentionally did create a heavier shape to begin with, so that way for you on the other side of the camera, you can really see the impact of these different techniques that we're using today. First thing I'm gonna do, now that I've assessed what I'm working on, and I can see everything that's happening, I'm gonna continue to work, starting towards the front, moving towards the back. The first thing I wanna do is lift my guest head up, and then after that, I'm going to start visually picking up subsections that I feel are weighted. And I'm going to showcase a handful of different personalization techniques, because the beauty of working on the horseshoe section is we have so much freedom to create art. It also allows me to know that I'm working in the right aspect of the head the whole time I'm doing it. Now when I lift this section up, we can see the weight to it. We can see that it's heavy. I don't hate the length though. So in order to remove weight or remanipulate the weight, but keep that length, I'm gonna go in with what I feel like this week is my favorite personalization skill, which is back cutting. I'm gonna start doing it very slow, and then we'll speed it up. So I'm taking my shear with my blade open. I'm going to start at the end in the underneath section of the hair that I'm cutting, and I'm going to be pushing my shear towards the head, almost closing my blade all the way, about 3/4 of the way as I push in, and then reopening as I pull back out. In a way, it's kind of similar to teasing the hair or back combing the hair. And what this is gonna do is slowly start to remove internal weight that's on the internal part of the haircut, but leaving the length that I decided on before we got started. So even with that one piece, we can see a massive difference between here on the haircut and here on the haircut, or at least I hope we can. I'm gonna continue to pick up subsections to continue to utilize my back cutting technique. And I'm stopping based on where I like to see that length at. Because ultimately, this is a technique that's going to primarily remove weight, but also take out a little bit of length. So going into my original shape, I knew I wanted to keep a little bit of length on it, which is why I kept the shape a little bit stronger to begin with. You can already see how much this technique's starting to collapse the shape that we put in. Another thing that's interchangeable with this technique specifically is you'll notice if I want to take even more weight out, I can continue to move and change my elevation and over direction as I'm cutting to remove double the amount of weight. So let's do that here in the back where she's got a really heavy weight line, just for visual fun. I'm gonna pick up my subsection, making sure I'm grabbing that hair that was originally in my horseshoe section, pull everything straight out. I'm gonna go in with my blade and slowly lift. And the more this is practiced, the more it will become just a nice fluid motion. But looking at that, compared to the opposite side where we still have a heavy weight line, we can see just how much weight this is taking out. Honestly, this is one of my favorite techniques for long layers, to diffuse a little bit of weight. There's hair in my mouth. Please excuse that. It also works really wonderful on maybe a one length bob for somebody that is extremely thick haired or has a lot of hair in their nape section. This is a really wonderful way to collapse the density without adding in graduation. It also is really easy to replicate when our guests come back in for another haircut because we're still working with the head shape. I'm still breaking down the haircut in the same subsections as I created it in. So I have that control, and when I have control, I can replicate.
This is a great question, Erica. Kellen asks, what are some signs to look for when there is too much texturizing? Sometimes I can get a little heavy-handed.
I feel you on that because me as well. I think that's something that a lot of us have, run into because it's just so much fun to detail. For me, one of the key indicators of when it's time to slow my roll or where maybe I should pump the brakes on my texturizing techniques are going to be when I start to lose control of the shape. So if I've created a shape already, and now I'm going in and I'm detailing and personalizing, and I feel like my shape's I'm losing it. It's not as much there, and when it comes to styling, the styling becomes harder. That for me is a really good indication that maybe it's time to take a step back or switch up techniques. A lot of the time, so we're gonna have a truth circle. Back when I first started in the industry, I feel like I personally struggled with over texturizing quite a bit because I didn't know when to start and when to end, which would ultimately end up with me creating an entire shape out of it, which does work. But the important part is remembering it when they come back in. But also, there are times that I will go in with a guest and focus with just one specific way of personalization for their whole detail process. I'll leave that in my notes, and then the next time they come in, I'll go with a different technique. So that way I'm not continuously removing weight from the same area over and over. Another way to really start to see that it's time to slow down on the personalization techniques will be when the ends start to look too fine, or whenever we get that veil of a layer line maybe a little bit, because ultimately personalization is going to be removing weight. It is going to be another way to go in and create specific details in a haircut by making it thinner, by skinnying it up. So in that case, when we think about whenever there's somebody with a finer hair type, we know that we can't go as much on the techniques with them because ultimately there's not going to be enough density to support a shape, whether it's in the perimeter or the fringe or even a face frame. But that doesn't mean that we can't texturize them. We just have to make that connection in our own brains to which kind of techniques are going to keep some of that weight in, which will actually bring me into my next personalization technique, which works wonders on our curly guests as well as our extremely fine haired guests. And what that is very simple. We're going to be picking up individual pieces of hair, once again hair that's living above the parietal, and holding them close to natural fall and blunt cutting. The reason this is incredible for our curly folks is because you'll notice I'm not cutting at an angle, I'm cutting blunt. If I know that curl, naturally, the way that somebody with curly hair, the hair is gonna grow out of the head, it's gonna be at a 45-degree angle on the ends. So when we think about texturization techniques, generally they're done at a 45-degree angle. 45 minus 45 is 0, my friend. Therefore, that means there's no hair left on the ends to detail out. So when we're working with a finer or curly texture, to see those specific pieces of detail, going in and blunt cutting little sections are going to visually give us pieces within the shape to be detailed without having to thin out. It becomes more of a manipulation of weight. I hope that is something that can be used by all. That's something I've been toying with more and more recently on a lot of my finer curly hair guests, and I've been loving it. Now that we've gone and removed quite a bit of weight, my last step to the shape is going in and manipulating with my hands. I want to be able to see my guest's hair start to live in the places that we envisioned it for the shape. So in her case, we've kept her a little mullety. We've detailed around her fringe. We've got her longer wispy pieces here on the sides. And lastly, what I want to see, so I would like to enhance this flip here, so that way it kicks out a little bit more. Also keeping in mind that she has the option to tuck and expose her ear. She can tuck everything and have more of a mullety fringe situation from the front, or she can leave it at natural fall with it kicking. Whenever I'm satisfied with the shape I've created, and the one thing I do want to do before we finish up is I'm going to use that channel cutting technique one more time on her left side. And because this side wants to live a little closer to her face, it seems, I'm going to take a horizontal section from above my parietal ridge, and instead of holding it out with my comb, I'm going to take it between my piece fingers and flip up, and I'm going to slowly punch cut, because now that it's flipped up, what this is going to do is it's taking those short pieces underneath the long and encouraging the hair here to flip out in order to really finalize my shape. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab 2 products, one being the volumetry spray from L'Oreal Professional. This is one of my favorite products from the line. This right here, it's made to be used on wet hair. However, I have found that it is incredible on dry hair. So because her hair is fairly smooth, more of my one formation, I need to create a little bit of texture. And sometimes I feel like the dry texture sprays can be not enough to really enhance that natural movement or that natural formation that may be in her hair that our guest doesn't even know about. So I'm gonna go in and get her fairly damp with the volumetry spray. Not to where she's dripping, but just enough to really force that separation of texture and piece her out. Taking my hands to really start to manipulate exactly where I want to see it live. I could then, if my guest is in a hurry, take a diffuser and have her show her how to place it away from her head to dry the volumetry spray, which will harden it up a little bit, but not so much that she can't run her hands through it. And then finally, we're gonna finish up with my favorite, the next day hair. And what this is a dry texture spray. I like to teach my guests to go in with their hands, place it on the top of the head, encourage separation, and do a scrunch situation. And then pump the product in rather than a full spray like we would spray a hairspray. I like to encourage some of that movement with the actual motion of the can, the way it sprays out on its own in the first place.
Kellen says, love, love, love.
I love, love, love you, Kellen.
Great question. With a shape like this, would you recommend doing the cut prior to the color?
Absolutely. So for me personally, I work with a lot of hair that's above the shoulders. Because of that, I know I want to make sure I can perfect that color to the haircut shape. So a lot of the time I will cut the shape first, then I'll color. A lot of the times I will go back and repersonalize at the very end just to perfect the marriage of the cut and the color combo for my guest.
Awesome. And where can people learn more from you?
So my name, once again, is Erica Lee Mumi. You can find me on Instagram at Erica Lee Mumi. I will put all of my information in the comments whenever we're done here today. But if you loved seeing anything that you learned today, you will see me at our L'Oreal Professional Academy in New York City in June, the weekend of the 5th and 6th, for the start of our brand new cutting certification. And then on the 13th, which is the day before my birthday, at the same location in New York City for my own personal built class, Customize Your Creativity. Both will utilize tons of the techniques that we learned today and even more. Both of those classes will also be working with all hair formations from straight to highly curly. So I really, really hope that you can join me. And if not, I will see you on Instagram. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you love the Pixie cut. Thanks, Hairbrained.